A racist police officer wrongly assumes that a black man in the park must be a criminal. Officer Derek Harlan watches Elijah Carter, a calm, quiet black man sitting alone, as though he were a threat. Moments later, Harlan decides to arrest him, completely unaware that Elijah is a high-ranking FBI agent. Officer Derek Harlan didn't see peace when he looked at Elijah Carter. He saw trouble. Sitting on a bench in Brookfield Park, reading quietly, Elijah was too calm, too composed. For Harlan, that was a red flag. A black man, sitting alone, acting like he belongs here. Harlan muttered under his breath, his eyes narrowing. Years on the force had made him trust his gut, and his gut told him Elijah was hiding something. Elijah, meanwhile, had no idea that a routine afternoon in the park was about to take a dark turn. For him, Brookfield Park was a place to unwind from the demands of his job, a quiet escape. But he knew, just as every black man in America knew, that peace could be shattered in a heartbeat. And today, it was Officer Harlan who intended to shatter it. Keeping his eyes locked on Elijah, Derek clenched his baton tighter, as though preparing for a chase. In his mind, Elijah wasn't a man seeking peace, he was a potential criminal, a suspect, an outsider. The presumption was clear, black meant danger. And today, he was determined to put Elijah in his place. Before we dive into this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell to stay updated with our latest stories. Now, let's get started. Derek strode over, his boots crunching against the gravel, eyes fixed on Elijah as though he'd caught him red-handed. Elijah looked up from his book just as Derek's shadow fell over him, a dark, looming figure of authority. Elijah felt that all too familiar tension knotting in his chest, but he met Derek's gaze with a calm, steady look. "Afternoon," Derek said, his tone polite but laced with suspicion. "Mind telling me what you're doing here?" He scanned Elijah from head to toe, eyes lingering on the book in Elijah's lap as if it held some secret. Elijah responded evenly. "Just reading. It's a nice day." He kept his tone calm, practiced. He'd been through this kind of questioning before, more times than he cared to remember. Yet, there was always that undercurrent of disbelief in his interrogator's voice, the unspoken presumption that he couldn't possibly belong. Derek's gaze hardened. "You from around here?" The question was as invasive as it was irrelevant, but Elijah knew exactly what Derek was really asking. "Do you belong here?" "Yes," Elijah answered simply, sensing Derek's frustration simmering. Elijah's calmness only seemed to irritate Derek, who took a step closer, his hand resting near his baton. "Let's see some ID," Derek demanded, his voice low and cold. The request hung in the air, weighted with every unjust encounter Elijah had endured. He paused, heart steady but wary. "Am I under arrest?" Derek's eyes flashed with impatience as he sized up Elijah, who sat with an unshaken calm. Elijah's simple question, "Am I under arrest?" was enough to ignite Derek's frustration. To him, Elijah's steady gaze felt defiant, as if this man had no fear of him, no respect for the authority he carried. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Derek shot back, his hand inching closer to the baton at his side. "Let's see some ID. Now." The words were sharp, unyielding, as though he'd already convicted Elijah in his mind. Elijah took a slow, measured breath. He knew the fine line he was treading. Refusing could escalate the situation. Complying meant surrendering to an unjust demand. Every instinct told him he shouldn't have to prove his right to simply sit in a public park. He held Derek's gaze, refusing to flinch. "I'm just here to enjoy my day," Elijah replied, his tone unwavering. "I don't think there's a law against that." Derek bristled. It wasn't just the words, it was Elijah's calm, the refusal to submit. In Derek's mind, this was a man challenging his authority, testing his patience. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," Derek said, his voice laced with a thin excuse that even he barely believed. But he wasn't about to admit he was wrong. "What description would that be?" Elijah asked, his voice steady, probing. Derek's jaw clenched, and for a moment, he was at a loss for words. But pride, fueled by the authority of his uniform, wouldn't let him back down. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped, taking another step closer. "Last chance. Show me some ID, or I'm taking you in." For a moment, the two men locked eyes, a silent battle of wills hanging thick in the air. Elijah felt the tension coil around him, the weight of Derek's hostility pressing closer. The park, once a place of peace, had become a battlefield, and every bystander who cast a curious glance their way seemed to turn a blind eye. Elijah took a deep breath, the cold realization settling over him. No matter what he said, Derek had already made up his mind. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his pocket, pulling out his wallet and handing over his ID. Derek snatched it from his hand, examining it with an intensity, as though expecting it to reveal some hidden crime. But the name meant nothing to him. It was a name he didn't recognize, and in his mind, that only reinforced his suspicion. "Stand up," Derek ordered, stepping back just enough to make room. Elijah could feel the unease in every movement, the sense of injustice lingering with each passing second. Elijah stood, moving carefully as Derek reached for his handcuffs. There was a tightening in his chest as he felt the cold metal clamp around his wrists, a sense of frustration mingled with resignation. Around him, a few people had started to watch, eyes flicking from him to Derek with expressions that were unreadable. Yet not one person spoke up. The silence felt as oppressive as the cuffs. As Derek led him toward the patrol car, Elijah maintained his composure. But he couldn't ignore the whispers that followed, subtle yet stinging. He knew what people assumed, an assumption that Derek himself was only too happy to reinforce by marching him through the park like a criminal. Each step felt like another weight added to the humiliation he'd spent years working to escape. "Get in," Derek ordered, opening the back door of the patrol car. Elijah slid inside, his hands bound tightly behind him, and felt the chill of the metal seat. The door slammed shut, sealing him off from the world outside. He stared out the window, watching Brookfield Park recede as Derek started the engine and drove toward the station. In the front seat, Derek glanced back through the rearview mirror, his gaze cold and assessing. "What were you really doing in that park?" he demanded, voice sharp and accusatory. "People like you don't just sit around reading." Elijah didn't flinch. He had spent years in rooms filled with men like Derek, men who looked at him and saw only what they wanted to see. "Like I told you, I was enjoying my day off," Elijah replied, his voice calm, though he felt the insult sting. Derek scoffed, as though Elijah's words were an outright challenge. "A day off? And doing what exactly? Plotting something?" The words were laced with accusation, as if Derek were certain he'd uncover some crime. Elijah's gaze turned to the passing streets, but inside, he felt a slow burn. He had never been one to show anger easily. Years of training had taught him to channel it, to let it fuel him quietly. But today, bound in the back of a patrol car for nothing more than sitting on a park bench, it took every ounce of control to keep his composure. They drove in silence, Derek glancing back at him now and then with that same hardened suspicion. Finally, they pulled up to the precinct, and Derek wasted no time leading Elijah inside. As they entered, heads turned, officers paused in their conversations to stare at the newcomer being brought in under suspicion. Elijah felt every gaze, felt the weight of their judgment pressing down like a storm cloud. Derek guided him to the booking area, where Officer Grant, a young officer with a quiet demeanor, looked up, his eyes widening slightly at the sight of Elijah in cuffs. There was a flicker of confusion in Grant's gaze as he looked from Elijah to Derek. "Caught him acting suspicious in Brookfield Park," Derek explained curtly, handing over Elijah's ID. Grant glanced at the ID, and for a brief moment, recognition sparked in his eyes before he quickly masked it. He nodded, tapping away at his computer, though his gaze kept drifting to Elijah with an air of quiet hesitation. "Captain Reeves is in her office," Grant said finally, handing back the ID. "You might want to bring him to her." Derek's jaw tightened. He hadn't intended to involve Captain Amanda Reeves so soon, but with Grant watching, he had little choice. "Fine," he muttered, grabbing Elijah's arm with a roughness that was hard to ignore. Elijah stayed silent as Derek led him down the hallway toward the captain's office. They stopped outside a door marked Captain Amanda Reeves. Derek rapped his knuckles against it, and a calm but firm voice called out from inside. "Come in." Derek opened the door, guiding Elijah into the room. Captain Reeves looked up from her desk, her eyes sharp and analytical as she took in the scene. A black man in cuffs, escorted by an officer whose stance radiated thinly veiled hostility. For a brief moment, there was a flicker of something in her gaze, something Elijah caught and held on to. Recognition, maybe? Understanding, even. "Officer Harlan, what's going on here?" she asked, her tone professional but laced with a subtle edge. Derek straightened, his grip still firm on Elijah's arm. "Caught this man in Brookfield Park, Captain. He was acting suspiciously, wouldn't show ID at first. Thought it was best to bring him in for questioning." Captain Reeves's gaze shifted to Elijah, and her eyes softened, if only slightly. She didn't need words to convey her doubt about Derek's story. It was there in the way her eyes lingered on Elijah's face, as though searching for the truth beneath the surface. Elijah met her gaze, steady and unflinching, feeling a glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, someone would listen. "Thank you, Officer Harlan," she said finally, her tone measured. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Carter alone. If you don't mind?" Derek hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with Captain Reeves' request. "Alone, Captain?" he repeated, his voice laced with surprise and resistance. He glanced at Elijah, then back at Captain Reeves, as if trying to read her intent. But her expression left no room for discussion. "Yes, Officer Harlan. Outside. Now." With visible reluctance, Derek released his grip on Elijah's arm, though his fingers lingered for a moment too long, as if reluctant to relinquish control. Elijah felt a sense of quiet relief as the door clicked shut behind Derek, leaving him alone with Captain Reeves. A calm silence filled the room, and for the first time, Elijah allowed himself to exhale. Captain Reeves leaned back in her chair, studying him with a look that was far different from Derek's hostile glare. Her gaze was assessing but without judgment. After a pause, she spoke, her tone softer yet steady. "Mr. Carter, I'm sorry you had to go through this." Her words were sincere, carrying a weight that cut through the lingering tension. Elijah sensed in her tone a recognition that what had happened to him was not only wrong but fundamentally unjust. Elijah acknowledged her apology with a small nod, understanding the significance of her words. He knew the protocol, knew how these situations often played out, with words sometimes failing to make up for the experience itself. Captain Reeves continued, her voice now calm but authoritative. "I've reviewed your file, Special Agent Carter. I know exactly who you are." The words lingered in the air, and for a moment, the reality of Elijah's position became stark. He was not just any man wrongly detained in a park, he was a high-ranking federal agent. Derek had, without knowing, misused his authority on someone with power beyond his understanding. Elijah saw it in her eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the power dynamics Derek had completely misread. And though Captain Reeves didn't need to spell it out, Elijah knew she saw him not just as an agent, but as someone who deserved the respect Derek had denied him. "Thank you, Captain," Elijah replied, his voice calm yet edged with frustration. "I appreciate your understanding." He chose his words carefully, drawing on the restraint he had been trained to master. But beneath his polite tone lay a deep-seated anger, a frustration that ran deeper than today's incident alone. This frustration wasn't just for himself. It was for everyone who had endured this same treatment without the protection of a badge. Captain Reeves's gaze softened slightly, and she spoke in a quieter tone. "You didn't tell Officer Harlan who you were," she observed, phrasing it as a statement rather than a question. Elijah's jaw clenched slightly, and he took a moment before replying. "Because it shouldn't have mattered, Captain." His voice was steady, but his words carried the weight of every unjust encounter he'd ever experienced. "I shouldn't have to be a federal agent to be treated with respect." A quiet moment passed, heavy with meaning, as his words sank in. Captain Reeves nodded slowly, her expression reflecting a rare empathy, a clear acknowledgement of the truth in his statement. You're absolutely right, Agent Carter, she said, her voice laced with conviction. It shouldn't matter. But sometimes it does. And that's exactly what we need to change. Elijah looked at her, and for a moment, he saw a spark of determination, a commitment to justice that seemed to go beyond mere protocol. It was a small glimpse of hope, a sign that perhaps she understood the depth of the problem, and was willing to do something about it. Captain Reeves straightened in her chair, her posture shifting back to one of authority and responsibility. I will handle this, Mr. Carter, she said firmly. Officer Harlan will face consequences for his actions. We can't allow this type of behavior to go unchecked. Elijah nodded, a hint of gratitude in his expression. He had long understood that justice wasn't always swift, nor was it always obvious. But moments like this, a single conversation, a glimmer of shared understanding, reminded him why he kept fighting for change. Captain Reeves gave him a brief but respectful nod. You're free to go, she said, moving to the door. But before she opened it, she paused and looked back at Elijah, her voice dropping just slightly. If there's anything you need, anything I can do, please let me know. Elijah met her gaze, offering a small but meaningful smile. Thank you, Captain. Your support means more than you know. She opened the door, her expression steely once again as she stepped out to call Derek back into the office. As Derek entered, his gaze flickered between the two, trying to read what he had missed. Captain Reeves's face held a calm authority that gave nothing away, while Elijah stood tall, his composure a quiet but undeniable reminder of his own strength. Derek's expression shifted, a shadow of uncertainty crossing his face as he met Captain Reeves's steady gaze. He could feel that something fundamental had changed, but he wasn't yet sure what it meant for him. Officer Harlan, Captain Reeves began, her tone brisk and unwavering. We need to have a serious discussion about your actions today. Derek's confidence faltered as Captain Reeves's sharp gaze fixed on him. Elijah, now standing free of handcuffs, held his head high, watching silently as she addressed Derek. Her voice was firm, almost cold, cutting through the tension with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Officer Harlan, she began, her tone unwavering. What you did today was unacceptable. You detained Mr. Carter without probable cause. You ignored protocol and let your assumptions dictate your actions. This department does not tolerate racial profiling, and I won't allow it to go unchallenged. Derek's face paled slightly, his gaze darting between Captain Reeves and Elijah. For the first time, he seemed to grasp the magnitude of his mistake. But still, his pride held firm. Captain, I was just following my instincts. I thought. Your instincts? Captain Reeves interrupted, her eyes narrowing. Officer, instincts are meant to protect us when there's real danger, not to justify targeting someone based on appearance alone. Mr. Carter's presence in the park wasn't a threat, and nothing he did warranted this treatment. She looked back at Elijah, a silent apology in her gaze, then turned back to Derek. You're dismissed for now, Officer Harlan. I'll be following up with internal affairs regarding this incident. Derek clenched his jaw, but he managed a stiff nod, clearly struggling to hold back a response. He glanced at Elijah one last time, but this time, his eyes held none of the arrogant certainty they had before. With a quick nod, he turned and left the room, his footsteps heavy as he disappeared down the hallway. As the door closed, Captain Reeves's gaze softened as she turned back to Elijah. Mr. Carter, I want to personally apologize for what happened today. You should never have had to experience this, especially not here. Her voice carried the weight of sincerity, and Elijah could sense that this was more than just a formal apology. It was a genuine attempt to right a wrong. Thank you, Captain, Elijah replied, his voice calm yet carrying a hint of the frustration he had worked hard to keep contained. I appreciate it. But as I said before, it shouldn't take a title or a badge to earn respect. She nodded, clearly understanding the broader significance of his words. You're absolutely right, Agent Carter. And I intend to make sure this message is heard throughout our department. People should be judged by their actions, not by appearances. Elijah gave her a small, respectful nod, appreciating her willingness to address the issue head-on. "I hope so, Captain. For everyone's sake." With that, Captain Reeves handed him back his ID, her expression a mix of regret and determination. "If there's anything you need from us, please don't hesitate to ask." Elijah took his ID and nodded. "Thank you, Captain. I appreciate your support." As he turned to leave, he paused, glancing back at her. "Captain, there's a lot of work to be done. But thank you for standing up for what's right." Captain Reeves nodded, a sense of resolve in her eyes. "We'll do better, Agent Carter." "That's a promise." Elijah left her office, walking through the station with a quiet dignity. Officers glanced his way, some with curiosity, others with a flicker of recognition. For a moment, the station seemed frozen in time, every gaze acknowledging the injustice he'd faced but, perhaps, also the need for change. As he stepped outside, the cool air hit his face, a wave of relief washing over him. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the day lift slightly. Yet, a deeper burden remained, the knowledge that this wasn't just his story, but the story of so many others who had faced similar injustices without anyone to speak up for them. He stood there for a moment, looking back at the building. Today, he had seen a glimpse of accountability, a small step toward justice. And though the path ahead would be long, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. There was work to be done, and he was ready to face it. Derek sat alone in the precinct's break room, his shoulders slumped and his mind racing. The walls around him felt as though they were closing in, pressing down with the weight of his actions. Just hours ago, he'd felt justified, certain even that he'd done the right thing. But now, after Captain Reeves's reprimand and Elijah Carter's silent composure, his confidence had crumbled. He glanced at the door to Captain Reeves's office, replaying her words over and over in his mind. "We don't tolerate racial profiling in this department." Those words echoed, harsh and unyielding, a stark contrast to the way he'd always operated. He had believed, in all his years on the force, that his instincts set him apart. But today, those same instincts had led him to target an innocent man, a federal agent, no less, simply because he didn't fit his image of who belonged. Derek's thoughts were interrupted by the quiet creak of the door opening. Officer Grant entered, glancing around the empty room before taking a seat across from him. He looked at Derek, his expression a mixture of concern and disappointment. "Rough day, huh?" Grant asked, though he seemed to already know the answer. Derek scoffed, but it lacked his usual confidence. "Yeah, you could say that." He rubbed his hands over his face, the reality of the situation settling like a weight on his chest. Grant didn't respond immediately. Instead, he studied Derek, as if searching for the right words. "You know, Derek, we've all got biases. But there's a difference between knowing they're there and letting them run your actions." Derek looked away, unwilling to meet Grant's gaze. "I was just trying to do my job. I thought he was a threat. I thought..." His voice trailed off, the excuses sounding hollow even to his own ears. Grant leaned forward, his tone more direct. "Did you really think he was a threat, or did you just see a black man who didn't fit your idea of what belonged in that park?" The question was blunt, cutting through Derek's defenses with a precision he hadn't expected. For a moment, Derek was silent. Deep down, he knew the truth, even if he didn't want to admit it. He had acted on assumptions, on a bias he never questioned, because it was easier than acknowledging his own prejudices. "Maybe I was wrong," Derek admitted finally, his voice low. "But I didn't think it would lead to this. I thought I was just doing what I'd been trained to do." Grant shook his head. "That's just it, Derek. Our training doesn't teach us to assume guilt based on how someone looks. We're supposed to protect, not judge." The words stung, but they struck a chord Derek couldn't ignore. All these years, he told himself he was protecting his community, keeping it safe. But today, that belief had shattered, leaving him to face the uncomfortable truth. Just then, Captain Reeves entered the room, her expression serious. She looked at Derek, her gaze steady and unyielding. "Officer Harlan, I've just come from speaking with Internal Affairs." You're being placed on administrative leave, effective immediately, pending an investigation into today's incident. Derek's heart sank. He'd known this might happen, but hearing it out loud made it real. He opened his mouth to argue, but one look at Captain Reeves's face told him it was pointless. Consider this a time for reflection, Derek, she continued, her tone firm but not unkind. You need to understand the weight of your actions and the impact they have on the people we serve. And on this department. She paused, then added, This is about more than one incident. It's about ensuring this doesn't happen again. With that, she left the room, leaving Derek alone with Grant once more. Derek felt a hollowness settle in his chest, the weight of his choices pressing down on him in a way he hadn't anticipated. Grant stood, giving Derek a final, thoughtful look. Take this seriously, Derek. It's not just about what happened today. It's about who you choose to be moving forward. As Grant left, Derek remained seated, staring at his hands. The badge he'd worn with pride now felt heavier than ever, a symbol of responsibility he'd taken for granted. For the first time, he questioned whether he was the person he had always believed himself to be. And in the silence of the room, Derek began to realize that he was the one who needed to change. Derek sat at the long, polished table in the precinct's conference room, surrounded by serious faces. On one side were officers from Internal Affairs, their expressions unreadable. At the end of the table sat Captain Reeves, calm and focused, but the sharpness in her eyes showed she was here to ensure the truth came out. Across from him was a figure Derek had hoped he wouldn't see again, Elijah Carter. Elijah's demeanor was composed, but Derek could sense the underlying strength in his gaze. It was a reminder that this wasn't just another formality. This was his chance to explain himself, and perhaps for the first time, to confront the impact of his actions. The head of Internal Affairs, Lieutenant Mark Stevens, began the proceedings. His voice was steady, yet carried a formality that made Derek shift in his seat. Officer Harlan, today's hearing will address the events surrounding the detention of Mr. Elijah Carter, an FBI agent, on the basis of suspicious behavior. This department has a responsibility to uphold justice without prejudice, and today we're here to determine if those principles were violated. Derek felt the weight of each word, but his gaze remained fixed on the table, avoiding Elijah's steady look. His mind was racing, searching for ways to justify his actions, yet knowing that excuses would sound hollow in a room this tense. Mr. Carter, Lieutenant Stevens continued, turning his attention to Elijah. Please recount the events as you experienced them. We want to understand exactly what transpired from your perspective. Elijah nodded, taking a moment before he began. I was sitting in Brookfield Park, reading a book, he said, his voice calm but firm. It was a peaceful afternoon, until Officer Harlan approached me. Without cause, he questioned why I was there, implied I was suspicious simply for being present. When I didn't immediately provide ID, he decided that I was a threat and proceeded to detain me. Derek flinched, feeling the sting of each word. Hearing it spelled out like this made his actions seem even more unreasonable, more rooted in his own assumptions than in any real threat. Elijah's gaze remained steady. What Officer Harlan didn't realize was that I am a federal agent, trained to remain calm under pressure. I knew that pushing back could escalate things, so I complied, hoping it would defuse the situation. But it didn't. The suspicion continued. I was treated as a criminal without a shred of evidence, based solely on an assumption about who I am and where I belong. The room was silent. Derek could feel the judgment settling over him, and it felt crushing. Still, he forced himself to speak, his voice shaky but determined. I was just doing my job. I saw someone who fit a general description we were on alert for, and my instincts told me something was off. Captain Reeves leaned forward, her gaze piercing. Officer Harlan, instincts are valuable, but they're not an excuse to act without cause. Your job is to assess real threats, not to create them based on bias. Her tone was firm, each word hitting Derek like a hammer. Lieutenant. Stevens looked to Elijah. Agent Carter, how did this experience affect you, personally and professionally? Elijah paused, choosing his words carefully. Professionally, it was a reminder that even in my position, I am still judged by my appearance before my character or qualifications. Personally, it was yet another instance in a long pattern that I, and many others, have faced. The humiliation, the presumption of guilt, it's something you carry with you long after the incident ends. Derek clenched his fists, the guilt tightening around him. He knew deep down that he was part of a problem he had always refused to acknowledge. This wasn't just about Elijah. It was about every person he'd ever judged before he knew them, every time he'd let assumptions cloud his judgment. Internal Affairs exchanged glances, then turned back to Derek. Officer Harlan, this isn't the first complaint we've received regarding similar actions. We've had reports, minor but notable, of questionable stops and detentions based on vague suspicions. Can you address this? Derek's face reddened, his defensiveness rising. I didn't mean any harm. I thought I was following the right procedures, being cautious. I never thought. I didn't realize it would come to this. Elijah spoke, his voice carrying a gravity that filled the room. Officer Harlan, harm isn't just about intent. It's about impact. And the impact of your actions is real, whether you intended it or not. The words struck a chord deep within Derek. He'd always defended himself with the idea that he meant well, that his intentions were good. But sitting here, faced with Elijah's calm yet undeniable truth, he was forced to confront the reality that intentions could never undo harm once it was done. Captain Reeves leaned forward, her expression resolute. Officer Harlan, we expect our officers to uphold the values of this department. To protect and serve, without bias or prejudice. You failed to meet those standards. And while this hearing isn't a trial, we must hold our officers accountable for their actions. Derek's voice was barely a whisper. I understand, Captain. Lieutenant Stevens spoke again, finality in his tone. The Internal Affairs Division will be reviewing Officer Harlan's conduct more thoroughly in the coming weeks, and disciplinary actions will be decided based on those findings. For now, Officer Harlan will remain on leave. Derek nodded numbly, the weight of his actions settling heavily on him. He'd entered the hearing determined to defend himself, but now, he felt only a hollow sense of regret, a realization that he couldn't undo what he had done. Elijah looked at him, his expression a mixture of sadness and resolve. I'm not here to ruin anyone's career, Officer Harlan. I'm here because I believe that change can happen, and that people can learn. But that learning starts with accountability. Derek managed a nod, his voice barely audible. I understand. And I'm sorry. It was the first apology he'd given, and though it felt inadequate, it was all he could muster. The hearing concluded, and as the officers filed out, Derek remained seated, staring at the empty table in front of him. Elijah's words echoed in his mind, challenging everything he'd once taken for granted. This was more than just a reprimand, it was a turning point, a reckoning he could no longer ignore. Later that week, Elijah found himself back at the precinct, this time under vastly different circumstances. Captain Amanda Reeves had asked to meet with him privately, and he agreed, sensing that there was more to say. As he walked through the halls, the atmosphere felt different. There were glances of recognition, some respectful nods from officers he hadn't seen before. It was subtle, but he could tell that his presence had left an impact. Captain Reeves greeted him with a firm handshake and a nod as he entered her office. Agent Carter, thank you for coming back, she said, her voice warm but serious. She motioned for him to sit, and he took a seat, meeting her steady gaze. Elijah, she began, setting aside the formalities. I want to extend my apologies once more, both as an officer and as a person. What happened to you was wrong. It exposed a problem in this precinct that's been overlooked for too long. Elijah appreciated her directness. Thank you, Captain Reeves, he replied. But my experience here is only one example of something that runs much deeper. Captain Reeves nodded, her expression somber. And that's why I wanted to talk to you today. This situation has pushed us to take a hard look at ourselves, at our training, our attitudes, and the assumptions that can undermine the very purpose of our work. I can't change what happened to you, but I can promise that it won't be ignored." There was a moment of silence, heavy with shared understanding. Elijah looked at her, seeing not just a captain but a leader who was determined to make things right. "Captain, I respect the commitment you're showing. But you know as well as I do that change isn't easy. There are deep-seated habits here, biases that don't shift overnight." Captain Reeves leaned back slightly, acknowledging the challenge with a slight nod. "That's true. But change doesn't start overnight. It starts with people willing to push for it, even when it's hard. We're implementing new training programs that focus on recognizing and overcoming bias, and that includes mandatory courses on de-escalation and cultural competency. I intend to make sure every officer here understands the weight of their role and the consequences of their actions." Elijah's eyes softened, a flicker of hope surfacing. "That's a start, Captain. Sometimes all it takes is a few people willing to confront the truth, to set an example." He paused, choosing his next words carefully. "But training can only do so much. Change is personal. It has to come from within." Captain Reeves met his gaze, understanding the deeper meaning of his words. "And that's why I asked you here, Elijah. We're going to need guidance from someone who understands what's at stake, someone who can help us build that change from the inside out. I'd like your help in advising on these reforms, if you're willing." Elijah considered her offer, feeling the significance of her request. It was more than a gesture. It was an invitation to help shape a new culture, one that valued justice over assumptions. "I'd be honored to help, Captain. But know that I won't hold back. If we're going to do this, we have to be thorough, to make sure it's meaningful." Captain Reeves smiled, a hint of pride in her expression. "I wouldn't expect anything less. We need honesty, no matter how uncomfortable it may be." Elijah nodded, feeling a quiet satisfaction as he reached out to shake her hand. "Then let's get to work, Captain. Change doesn't happen because it's easy. It happens because it's necessary." Captain Reeves shook his hand firmly, her determination mirrored in his own. They had both seen the cracks in the system, but now they were prepared to do the work needed to heal it. And though the road would be long, Elijah felt the weight of her commitment as a foundation for something better, a step toward a future where moments like his own might one day be a thing of the past. In the weeks following Elijah's encounter with Officer Derek Harlan, changes began to ripple through the precinct. The quiet reform efforts Captain Reeves had promised Elijah were becoming a visible reality, signaling a new chapter for the department. For the first time, officers filed into mandatory training sessions on bias awareness and cultural sensitivity, with seasoned professionals brought in to lead discussions and workshops. The training wasn't simply a matter of watching videos or completing paperwork. It involved open conversations, uncomfortable questions, and scenarios that challenged officers to examine their own assumptions. Elijah himself had agreed to help develop parts of the program, ensuring that the curriculum tackled real issues rather than glossing over them. During the first few sessions, the room was filled with skepticism and silence. Some officers were reluctant to engage, folding their arms across their chests, shifting in their seats, or casting glances that spoke volumes of their resistance. But the facilitators didn't shy away from addressing the difficult topics. They showed body cam footage, not just of Elijah's experience, but of other incidents across the country, sparking a range of emotions, from anger to guilt to deep introspection. Captain Reeves made it clear from the start that there would be no tolerance for dismissive attitudes. "We owe it to the people we serve," she told them firmly, her voice leaving no room for argument. "And we owe it to ourselves to be the kind of officers who respect the dignity of every person. This isn't optional, it's a responsibility we all share." Elijah occasionally observed these sessions from the back of the room, witnessing the reactions unfold in real time. Some officers gradually began to engage, their skepticism giving way to understanding as they considered perspectives they hadn't encountered before. For many, this was the first time they'd been asked to confront the reality of their biases head-on. One day, during a session on implicit bias, the facilitator posed a direct question. "How many of you have ever stopped someone because you felt they didn't belong somewhere?" The room fell silent, a few heads lowered, others looked away. The question hung in the air, challenging everyone to confront the truth they often ignored. One of the younger officers, Officer Thompson, hesitated before raising his hand. I think I've done that," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't even realize it until now. I just thought I was keeping people safe." The facilitator nodded, acknowledging his courage. "Thank you, Officer Thompson. Recognizing it is the first step. But keeping people safe doesn't mean judging them by their appearance. We have to ask ourselves, are we truly seeing people for who they are, or are we acting on assumptions that have no place in policing?" The session continued, but that moment lingered, a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained biases could be. Elijah observed quietly, feeling a small sense of hope. He could see that some were beginning to grasp the weight of their actions, the damage caused by even the smallest assumptions. Outside of the training sessions, changes were also being made to the department's protocols. Captain Reeves had pushed for new guidelines on de-escalation, emphasizing the importance of communication over confrontation. Officers were now required to approach situations with a mindset of respect and caution, understanding that escalation was a last resort. These new measures didn't sit well with everyone at first. Some officers grumbled about restrictions, feeling that their authority was being undermined. But for others, the changes were a welcome shift. Officer Grant, who had witnessed Elijah's detainment and later voiced his concerns to Derek, was among those who openly supported the reforms. He approached Captain Reeves one afternoon, expressing his gratitude. "This training, it's long overdue, Captain," he admitted. "I've seen things here that just didn't sit right, but I never thought it was my place to say anything. Now maybe things will finally start to change." Captain Reeves nodded, a sense of pride in her expression. "Thank you, Officer Grant. Change doesn't come easy, but it starts with people willing to step up." The reforms also included a new feedback system, where civilians could share their experiences with the department anonymously. This system allowed the community to voice their concerns and report any incidents of bias without fear of retaliation. Each complaint would be reviewed, and any reports of profiling or unnecessary force would be addressed directly, with potential disciplinary actions taken if warranted. This new system, however, wasn't without its critics. Some officers felt the department was becoming too soft, or worried that civilians might take advantage of the system. But Captain Reeves remained resolute, reminding them that transparency was essential to rebuilding trust with the community. "We're here to protect and serve, not just enforce. If we're going to build trust, we have to be willing to listen, even when it's uncomfortable." In addition to formal changes, a cultural shift was beginning to take root. The precinct saw more open discussions among officers, conversations that would have once been shut down as too sensitive or personal. Some shared their experiences of bias, even within the department, while others shared stories from their communities. These exchanges, once rare, were fostering a new level of respect and understanding among the team. One afternoon, after a particularly intense session on cultural competence, Officer Thompson approached Elijah, who had stayed behind to observe. Thompson's face was a mixture of uncertainty and gratitude. "Agent Carter," he began, his voice tentative, "I just wanted to say, I didn't get it before. But hearing your story, seeing everything laid out, it's starting to make sense. I know I've made mistakes. And I'm sorry. I'm trying to do better." Elijah nodded, feeling the sincerity in Thompson's words. "Acknowledging it is a big step, Officer Thompson. It's not easy to change, but being willing to learn, that's the path forward. Just remember, we're all human. But it's what we do after we recognize our mistakes that defines us." Thompson gave a small nod, visibly affected. As he walked away, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. Change was slow, but he could see it here, unfolding one conversation, one realization at a time. The reforms weren't just about new policies. They were about reshaping the core values of the department. And as Elijah watched the precinct take its first steps toward true accountability, he felt a cautious optimism. The path was long, and the challenges far from over, but for the first time, he believed that the precinct was on the right track. Derek sat alone in his small apartment, the quiet pressing in on him from every corner. His uniform, once a source of pride, hung limp in his closet, a stark reminder of the man he thought he was. Now on leave, he had no badge, no authority, and no purpose to ground him. The silence was unforgiving, amplifying the mistakes he could no longer ignore. Every day since the hearing had been a reckoning, forcing him to confront his actions. His mind replayed Elijah's words, that steady voice cutting through Derek's defenses. Harm isn't just about intent. It's about impact. The sentence rang in his ears, unshakable, because deep down, Derek knew that Elijah was right. He'd let his assumptions dictate his actions, thinking he was only following his instincts. But now, stripped of his role, he saw his so-called instincts for what they really were: unchecked bias. As he sat on his worn-out sofa, Derek found himself scrolling through news articles on his phone, reading stories of others who'd been targeted, judged, or humiliated simply for how they looked. The experiences Elijah had spoken of weren't isolated. They were part of a larger pattern, one he had unknowingly contributed to. He felt a knot tighten in his chest, a mix of shame and regret. For the first time, Derek was forced to see himself through the eyes of those he judged. He thought about all the times he'd stopped someone because they didn't fit, or lingered longer on a suspect because something felt off. He'd dismissed these actions as good policing, but now they felt like a betrayal of the very ideals he once swore to uphold. Protect and serve? He could barely justify that to himself now. Derek's thoughts drifted back to the station, where mandatory training sessions were in full swing. He'd heard about the bias awareness programs, the new de-escalation protocols, and the cultural competency workshops. Part of him felt resentment, a pang of resistance. Training couldn't change the reality of policing. But another part, quieter yet growing, wondered if maybe he'd been wrong. Maybe this training could make a difference. One afternoon, while in the precinct to gather some personal items, Derek passed by one of these sessions. He lingered outside the door, listening to officers discuss scenarios similar to what he had done to Elijah. The facilitator's voice carried through the hallway. Biases don't make you a bad person. They make you human. But acting on those biases without question? That's where the damage begins. Derek shifted uncomfortably, feeling the truth in those words settle over him. He realized he was afraid of what acknowledging his own flaws meant for his identity. If he admitted he'd been wrong, then what did that say about the last 20 years he'd spent on the force? The door to the training room opened, and Officer Grant stepped out, catching sight of Derek. For a moment, there was silence as the two men looked at each other, then Grant nodded. You should join us, Derek. These sessions, they're hard, but they're worth it. Derek opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He simply nodded, unsure if he was ready to face the truths the training would reveal. But as he walked back to his desk, Grant's words stayed with him, challenging him to confront what he'd spent so long denying. That night, unable to sleep, Derek found himself sitting at his kitchen table, a single light illuminating the space around him. He pulled out a notebook, something he hadn't touched since his academy days, and began to write. At first, it was simple, a list of thoughts, a stream of questions he didn't yet have answers to. What was I afraid of? Why did I assume he was a threat? Who am I protecting? What am I really trying to uphold? With each line, the questions grew deeper, peeling back the layers of his own beliefs, fears, and misconceptions. He thought of his family, his friends, his community, and how he'd always believed he was doing right by them. But was he? For hours, Derek wrestled with his thoughts, writing and crossing out sentences, trying to make sense of the man he saw reflected back at him. By dawn, his notebook was filled with words he never thought he'd write, admissions of his faults, his regrets, and an unsettling truth he could no longer deny. His loyalty had been to his own image of authority, not to justice. As the sun rose, Derek stared at the words on the page, feeling a strange mix of sorrow and resolve. He knew he couldn't undo the past, couldn't erase the harm he'd caused. But perhaps, he thought, he could at least start to make amends. With a heavy heart, he picked up his phone and dialed Captain Reeves. The phone rang twice before she answered, her tone professional but not unfriendly. "Captain Reeves here." "Captain," Derek began, his voice low, almost hesitant. It's Officer Harlan. I just wanted to say, I want to make this right. I don't know how yet, but I want to learn. I'm ready to take responsibility for what I did." There was a pause on the other end, and then Captain Reeves's voice softened. "Acknowledging that is the first step, Derek. If you're willing to learn, there's a place for you in these training sessions. But only if you're truly committed." Derek nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I am, Captain. I don't want to be the person I was anymore. I want to do better." As he hung up, a weight lifted from Derek's shoulders, though a new responsibility settled in its place. He had a long road ahead, one that would require him to unlearn years of assumptions and relearn what it truly meant to protect and serve. For the first time in his career, he felt something he hadn't expected: hope. A few months after his encounter with Derek, Elijah returned to the precinct. This time, he wasn't here as a detainee or even a witness, but as an advisor helping Captain Reeves and her team implement lasting reforms. The precinct felt different. There was a subtle shift in the air, a tone of respect and attentiveness that hadn't been there before. As Elijah walked through the familiar hallways, he noticed small but significant changes. Posters promoting inclusivity and ethical policing lined the walls, with reminders about de-escalation and the importance of empathy in every interaction. Bulletin boards featured announcements for ongoing training sessions, feedback opportunities, and statements affirming the department's renewed commitment to justice and integrity. Elijah observed groups of officers gathered in conversation, discussing scenarios from their recent training. Their voices were serious, reflective, and he could see that they weren't just going through the motions. They were grappling with new ideas, questioning assumptions, and, from what he could tell, challenging each other in constructive ways. This wasn't just a policy shift, it was a cultural shift. Just then, Officer Grant noticed Elijah and walked over, extending a hand. "Agent Carter, good to see you back," he said, a genuine warmth in his tone. "I wanted to thank you. Things here, they're changing, really changing." Elijah shook his hand, appreciating the sincerity in Grant's voice. "It's good to see it firsthand. This precinct has come a long way in a short time," Elijah replied, glancing around. "But the real work is in keeping that momentum going." Grant nodded, a look of determination crossing his face. "That's exactly what we're trying to do. The training is tough, some days we leave the room exhausted. But it's different. It's making us think before we act, making us more aware of the impact we have on people's lives." As they spoke, Officer Thompson approached, joining the conversation with a nod to Elijah. "Agent Carter, I know we've talked a bit before, but I just wanted to say, thank you. Your story made me see things differently. It's humbling, realizing how much we missed." Elijah smiled, his respect for these officers growing. "It takes strength to admit that, Officer Thompson. Change isn't about perfection, it's about progress, every single day. Just the fact that you're willing to question things is already a huge step." He continued down the hallway, passing by an open door to a training room where a session was underway. Inside, officers were engaged in a role-play exercise, simulating a scenario that emphasized de-escalation and respect. The instructor guided them through each step, stressing the importance of communication and empathy over force. Elijah saw faces he recognized, including some who had once resisted this very training. Now, they were actively participating, intent on learning how to handle situations differently. Finally, as he reached Captain Reeves's office, Elijah took one last look around. The precinct had begun to reflect a sense of unity and purpose that felt authentic. It was no longer just a building, it was becoming a place of genuine accountability, where officers weren't merely following orders, but actively embracing a new standard. Captain Reeves greeted him at the door, a smile of gratitude on her face. "It's good to have you back, Elijah," she said. "We couldn't have done this without you." Elijah shook her hand, a deep sense of fulfillment washing over him. Thank you, Captain. But remember, this is just the beginning. Elijah left the precinct with a sense of renewed hope. Standing outside, he looked back at the building, a place that had once symbolized injustice but was now slowly transforming into a symbol of accountability. He took a deep breath, feeling the crisp air fill his lungs, and let a quiet sense of satisfaction settle over him. Change was happening. Small, steady steps were beginning to shift the culture of the precinct, and in turn, perhaps even the community it served. As he walked down the steps, Elijah's thoughts turned to the future. He knew this was only the start of a much longer journey, not just for the precinct but for himself as well. The path toward justice was demanding, filled with obstacles and resistance, yet it was a path he was determined to walk. He felt a responsibility not only to himself but to everyone who had ever faced the same unjust assumptions, the same dismissive glances, and the same unwarranted scrutiny. Moments later, Captain Reeves joined him on the steps, her face reflecting both the challenges and triumphs of the past months. Elijah, we still have a long way to go, she said, her voice both steady and filled with resolve. Elijah nodded, his gaze set firmly on the road ahead. Yes, we do. But every step forward matters. Even the smallest progress adds up. Captain Reeves smiled, a shared understanding passing between them. You know, this precinct is better because of your willingness to stand up and demand more of us. And I promise, we won't stop here. Elijah looked at her, feeling a sense of mutual respect that had grown out of shared goals and determination. Thank you, Captain. It's about time we all start demanding more. From our leaders, from our communities, and from ourselves. As Elijah turned to leave, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This journey wasn't just about changing policies. It was about changing hearts and minds, one precinct, one community at a time. The hope in his chest was tempered with the understanding that real change would require time and relentless commitment. But he was ready. They were ready. He looked one last time at the precinct, feeling the weight of responsibility balanced with the promise of a better future. He knew there would be setbacks, hard days, and moments of doubt, but standing here now, he was filled with a quiet confidence. Justice was not an easy path, but it was a worthy one. As he walked away, Elijah felt a quiet determination settle in. The work had only just begun, but he knew that he, and everyone committed to change, could make a difference. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Join us as we continue to explore stories of resilience, justice, and the power of standing up for what's right. Together, we can bring about the change we want to see in the world.